running slightly later than planned. This is BBC One with the news, with Sophie Rayworth.
At least 11,000 people dead in South Asia after the biggest earthquake for 40 years. Thousands are swept to their deaths by huge waves triggered by the quake. Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand and the Maldives have all been badly hit. Many of the dead are children and the elderly. Entire communities are destroyed. Holidaymakers are among those who've been killed. Hundreds are unaccounted for. And in Ukraine, early celebrations as the opposition looks on course to win the presidential election. Good evening. More than 11,000 people have been killed across southern Asia after the world's biggest earthquake in 40 years. The underwater quake sent giant waves up to 10 meters high rolling across the Indian Ocean. Without warning, the water engulfed the coasts of many countries. The quake, measuring 8.9 on the Richter scale, struck just off Indonesia's northwestern tip. Indonesia, Sri Lanka and India have been worst hit, with entire villages destroyed and people swept away by the floodwaters. The giant waves also spread to Thailand, Malaysia and the Maldives and devastated resorts popular with British tourists. Ben Brown reports.
They call these waves tsunamis, terrifying walls of water up to 30 feet high, which tore into coastlines across southern Asia. The first and biggest was quickly followed by others, all triggered by the world's most powerful earthquake in almost half a century. In Sri Lanka, these people clung desperately to a building and to each other. But the current was too strong for them, and some were swept away. So too were homes, shops, cars, anything in fact that dared to stand in nature's way. Lucky survivors scrambled onto overturned buses, not dry land, but safety of a sort. Many in Sri Lanka have been less fortunate. The death toll here alone is 4,000 and rising.
The first we knew was at about 10 o'clock when there was a crash of tables and chairs turning over outside and people screaming. We leapt up. The water was by then coming under the door. As we dashed out, the windows came caving in and we were neck deep in water in the corridor, being swept along with all the tables and chairs out of the restaurant.
In southern India too, vast swathes of countryside have been submerged. Railways snapped in two, trains tossed from their tracks. Here, another 3,000 people at least are dead, hundreds of fishermen among them, their little boats overwhelmed by the deadly waves the earthquake had unleashed. Some have been rescued by helicopters. This survivor was lowered onto a beach, but elsewhere bodies are now being washed ashore. Here in Thailand, people see in the distance the tsunami rolling in towards them. These pictures filmed by a holidaymaker in Phuket. Tourists were among the victims here. For thousands of them, this is all that's left of their dream Christmas break. Idyllic resorts and beaches devastated by the disaster. Hotels and holiday bungalows destroyed. Divers, snorkelers and sunbathers swept out to sea. In the Maldives too, tourists have seen their holidays transformed into ordeals of terror.
We managed to get back to the desert island when this absolutely enormous, huge wave struck us, and we found ourselves, eventually we regrouped and we clung to the trees on this island. That was all that was there, and we sort of cowered in the trees. My smallest child is 6 years old, and she was yanked by the waves and sort of clung on to my husband, who anchored her down.
Across the region, the hospitals have been filling up fast, and so too have the mortuaries. It took the gigantic tsunami waves just a few minutes to kill. This was Indonesia, epicenter of the earthquake that caused them, and that measured 8.9 on the Richter scale. Here, people ran for their lives, from the biggest quake to hit the planet since 1964. No one yet knows exactly how many victims this disaster will claim. So far, the death toll stands at well over 11,000, but the fear and the expectation is that will rise considerably. Ben Brown, BBC News.
The epicentre of the quake was deep beneath the Indian Ocean, yet the destruction has been spread across a huge region. The quake triggered a giant wave of water which sped across thousands of miles of the Indian Ocean. David Shukman looks at how the disaster unfolded.
On a beach in Thailand, the crowds flee in panic as the sea turns against them. The nightmare threat of giant tsunami waves was suddenly reality. The waters acquired terrifying new power and reached deep inland. Tsunami waves are destructive because of their size and speed. They can reach 400 miles an hour. As they approach the coast, the peaks of the waves are forced upwards. Today they were several stories high. And what makes the impact all the worse along the shoreline is that behind the waves comes a vast and devastating mass of water. The cause of this disaster lies in the pattern of tectonic plates that divides the Earth's surface. The Indian plate and the Eurasian plate are in collision, and in the zone where the earthquake struck, the Indian plate is being forced deeper underground. This time it jolted with great violence and shifted the seabed as much as 10 meters. The effect of this was felt right across the ocean, the quake generating a series of tsunami waves. So how does this compare with previous quakes? Well, the one in Bam in Iran last year measured 6.3 on the Richter scale. This one measured 8.9, the fifth biggest for a century. And as to the waves, today's were 10 meters high, while the waves that struck Papua New Guinea 6 years ago were 17 meters high. Still, today's onslaught was one of the most dangerous of recent times.
This is just crazy. Look at it. It's just covering the screen.
At the British Geological Survey, experts were left stunned, not by the location of the event, but by its scale.
This is known to be an active area which has produced large earthquakes in historical times. But you can't tell exactly when an earthquake is going to strike.
But the waves took up to 3 hours to strike, so could there have been a warning? There is a system for monitoring tsunamis in the Pacific, but the people beside the Indian Ocean had no chance. David Shukman, BBC News.
The Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, says Britain is doing everything it can to help the thousands of British tourists affected by the disaster. At least 2 Britons are now known to have died in Thailand and the Maldives. Dozens more have been injured. Here, the police say the number of calls to a UK helpline number is among the highest ever experienced for a major incident. Daniel Bircher reports.
This is what one of Thailand's most popular tourist resorts looked like today, the island of Phuket. Holidaymakers who came here for a winter break now helping to tend the wounded as they wait for medical assistance. About 60 Britons have been taken to hospital here. Many foreign tourists are among those still missing. Others now at the airport, just desperate to get home.
It was like a battlefield. There was tables, there was all sorts all over the place. We got behind a tree and we eventually ended up to here in water.
This is what draws so many to this region, the stunning scenery and beaches. Here, Koh Phi Phi, location for the Hollywood movie The Beach, a magnet for tourists. But this is what's been left behind on the island, another resort hit hard. Travel operators believe around 10,000 British holidaymakers are in the areas affected, most of those on package tours in Thailand, Sri Lanka and the Maldives.
The tour operators are making contact with them as quickly as they can, trying to find ways of getting them to safety, and eventually, of course, over the next 2 days to fly them home back to the UK.
Here, a helpline for relatives set up by the Foreign Office has been so busy, volunteers at a police training centre have had to be brought in. Even so, it's hard to get through. Harold and Doreen Mowbray tried for hours to get news about their daughter, who's in Sri Lanka. Eventually, she phoned them.
You are very, very lucky. Oh, dear me. You're all right. They're safe, They're both all right. They're wonderful, but the hotel's completely gone. And all they've got is what they're standing up in, the clothes and everything.
Tonight, tourists are still being moved from some resorts. Others are waiting in shelters or receiving medical care. 5 charter planes from Britain are flying empty to the region to bring holidaymakers back. Daniel Bircher, BBC News.
For the latest from the region, we can speak to Kylie Morris, who's in the Thai resort of Phuket, and Navdeep Dhariwal, who's in the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo. Kylie, first of all, Phuket very popular at this time of year. What is the latest you have on British casualties there?
Well, we know that there is at least one British tourist who's confirmed to have died, a woman. The British Embassy here isn't giving out any more detail than that, but we know that this woman was holidaying on Phuket at the time of the wave hitting. We also have unconfirmed reports of at least one other Briton injured as well, who has been killed as well. Here at one of the hospitals in Phuket, at the Phuket International Hospital, there are more than 80 Britons who are being treated. It seems that most of them have fairly severe fractures. We know that as many as 500 people are still missing. That's of course of great concern to all the rescue workers and embassy staff here. They're getting out to those remote resorts today. That's their main focus in order to find out what's happened there.
And Navdeep, in Sri Lanka, I know Sri Lanka has been particularly hard hit. You've only just arrived there, but what's the latest?
Well, what we know is that the force of the waves has hit the east and southern coastal belt areas of the island. Both areas very high resort areas, tourist areas for tourists who've arrived here. The town of Galle and Hembentota, particularly in the south, among some of the worst affected. We're seeing pictures on the local channels here showing Galle town completely submerged underwater. British officials, we're being told, are now trying to reach parts of the island, and a rescue team will attempt to land at Galle probably sometime tomorrow. And here in the capital, Colombo, they've set up a reception and a relief centre to help tourists who are trying to make their way to the capital. But the Sri Lankan authorities have deployed 20,000 of their own troops. But the death toll rising all the time. I mean, earlier we were saying 4,000. Now we're hearing figures of 4,500, and that could probably creep up to be much, much higher.
Navdeep, thank you very much. In other news, exit polls suggest the opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko has won the rerun of Ukraine's presidential election. The largest of the polls gives Mr. Yushchenko a clear lead with more than half the votes, with the Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, on 41%. Our correspondent Stephen Rosenberg is in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. His report contains flash photography.
In Ukraine tonight, they're down to the count.
Yushchenko.
And after the massive fraud which marred last month's vote, this time the pressure's on to get the numbers right. At this polling station in Kiev, representatives from both sides were double-checking each ballot. Voting earlier, Viktor Yushchenko said he was 100% sure of victory. Across the city, his opponent Viktor Yanukovych looked equally confident. But by the evening, Mr. Yanukovych had acknowledged the possibility he might lose. If he did, he said, he would form a powerful opposition to the government. On Independence Square, the mood was very different. Initial results met with jubilation by Viktor Yushchenko's supporters. Their candidate, who they believe had been cheated of the presidency last time round, was now ahead. For some of those here who felt they'd taken to the streets to defend democracy, it was an emotional moment.
We're sure that we will win. We were sure in that from the first days when we stay here.
Viktor Yushchenko's supporters are convinced now that their man is just hours away from victory. But there's no complacency here. After one of the dirtiest elections Ukraine's ever seen, these people are determined to stay on this square until they're sure that Mr. Yushchenko has won. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Kiev.
Cricket and an England batting collapse has put South Africa on top on the first day of the second test in Durban. Sean Pollock took 4 wickets for the home side as England were bowled out for 139, their lowest test score in 4 years. In reply, South Africa were 70 for 3 at the close. And that's it. You can get the latest on the earthquake throughout the night over on BBC News 24. But from all of us here, good night.
Hello there. It's been a dry and sunny Boxing Day for most of us, but we're really paying the price now. It's very cold and frosty out there, except further northwest across Northern Ireland and the northwest of Scotland. Here we're seeing the breeze blowing in rather more in the way of cloud, and courtesy of this very weak weather front, we've seen a few spots of rain. That's continuing to journey further into Scotland, but it's running into this wedge of cold air, so there's a possibility of some icy patches for the south and east of Scotland. Could be a few icy patches elsewhere following the earlier showers, particularly across parts of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and Norfolk as well. As we head into holiday Monday, it's going to be a cold and bright start with some sunshine across much of England and Wales. Head further north, we will see more in the way of cloud pushing in. Not much rain in the morning for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but it will turn wet and windy in the northwest later on in the day. And we will see more cloud just easing its way into England and Wales, with the best of the sunshine hanging on towards the southeast and East Anglia. But with that cloud coming in after the frosty start, it's going to be another cold day for England and Wales, but it will be turning much milder for Scotland and Northern Ireland. But it will be turning windy, and eventually it will be turning wet as well. That rain arriving later in the afternoon, and then that band of quite heavy rain sweeping its way across the rest of the country overnight, eventually clearing the southeast Tuesday morning, but very quickly turning cold behind that. Another dose of snow for Scotland, especially over the hills. A few wintry showers elsewhere. For much of England and Wales, though, it should be dry and bright with some sunshine.